Well, I'm delighted to be here and to feel the kind of spirit that's in this place. How you greeted each other this morning and the way you broke bread and had coffee says that there's a very sweet spirit in here. Hey, Lee, I didn't even know you came in. It's good to see you. Everybody except my husband is here. He's golfing in Phoenix. But we won't hold that against him. He gave me great flowers for Valentine's Day, so he's in good shape. You know, one of the things that I find is that being Americans, we are extremely ignorant about our history. We segment and we believe that the one-person narrative from whose perspective history was written was really the whole story. And yet you read the Bible and realize that the women who wrote chapters of the Bible were left out. So you recognize that even when it comes to women, no matter race or the mythologies of it, that even their voices are left out. So today I want to share a little bit about American history with you through my own eyes and through the lens of Langston Hughes in his work titled The Ballad of Roosevelt. So in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, we declare these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. 1789, black men are 3/5 of a human being, black women, 2. 1789, George Washington is elected president unanimously. And we are given the narrative written down by the conqueror that George Washington never told a lie, but he was human, and I bet he told lots of lies, just like we all have likely been guilty of telling lies. His wife was one of the largest slaveholders of black people in the country, that at the same time we are co-founding democracy and capitalism in a slave system. It almost boggles the mind because democracy is the antithesis of slavery. James Baldwin indicated that it was on the backs of his women and the murder of his children for nothing that the wealth of the United States was built. And in 1820, we created the Missouri Compromise, allowing Maine to join the Union as a free state while Missouri was admitted as a slave state. 1822, they don't tell the story of Denmark Vesey, who led a revolt in Charleston, South Carolina, for which he was hanged in 1831. In Virginia, Nat Turner, the preacher, led the most significant slave revolt in history, and Virginia responded with stricter slave laws. 1849, Harriet Tubman, it said, crossed the north, the line to the north, and she looked down at her hands and said she saw a glory over everything. She became the powerhouse of the Underground Railroad. The story is told about Harriet Tubman that the first time she came to the north, she crossed with others, and they didn't turn around. But the second time she brought a shotgun because in the first party, 2 people wanted to turn around, so she decided to say, go forth to freedom or die, that the freedom for all of us is greater than the concern you have about turning around. In 1857, James Buchanan is elected the 15th president of this republic, and 11 of the first 15 presidents held slaves. Black people, so to speak, have only been emancipated for 3 generations. When we ask ourselves, why can't they do better economically? Why aren't they further ahead socially? Why aren't they better health-wise? Then we can ask ourselves what roots it has. In a story somebody told a long time ago, 1861 sees the start of the Civil War. The narrative that we're given says that Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves, but when you read Lincoln's own writings, he was completely unconcerned about the slavery question. He was concerned about the preservation of the Union. It's suggested that in 1863 he emancipated blacks, but Juneteenth, celebrated June 19th of 1865, was the first time that blacks in Texas heard they were free, so they worked 2 more years, not realizing that he issued them some degree of emancipation. And then the story is told by Lincoln himself that he was not sure whether black people would rise up and want to burn down the plantations and hurt the people who had hurt them. But then the ancestors tell the story that the very first thing we did was look for our brother and my husband. They sold my son a long time ago. The interest in burning things down isn't any more true today than it was then, but that's still the majority narrative. In 1866, the conversation begins about reparations with the Freedmen's Bureau. Frederick Douglass, freed slave on his own, who taught himself to read at risk of his own death by playing a game with the master's son, and he would say, I bet you can't read. I bet you can't spell this word. I bet you can. I bet you can't. And the little boy would spell the word. And at risk of his death, Frederick would go home and write it down. And he became one of the great orators of our time. In 1863, following Watch Night, the Watch Night service where December 31st, 1862, blacks everywhere awaited the Emancipation Proclamation and this idea of freedom. At the same time, we passed the Homestead Act in the United States, which allowed white people to claim land if they lived there for 5 years, land that wasn't theirs. Malcolm X said, "What's every revolution been about in the history of the world? Land. The landlord against the landless." Don't make any mistake. The money in your house is not in your house itself. The money is in the land. And the Homestead Act ensured that Native Americans would not be able to keep the land that they were given. A young lady in the service was talking about Native American resistance to forcible removal. You might want to pick up a book called We Have Spoken. It's largely a compilation of speeches made by Native American chiefs to the United States military that keep saying, "You told us to go over here, you moved us over here, and you said you would leave us alone, but now you're over here. And then you moved us to this little teeny part that doesn't have anything in it, and now you're over here. And alcohol isn't good for our people, and we ask that you stop giving it to them." And we ask ourselves how the Native American myth about drunkenness comes to light. It began all that time ago. 1865 to 1877 sees the period of Reconstruction, the time when African Americans post-emancipation had the greatest number of seats in Congress ever. It also began the creation of what's called the condemnation of blackness by Dr. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, a time when the statisticians would go to the jails and they would not report on white prisoners, only black, and begin the narrative that black is synonymous with crime, that black children should be feared, that black men, most of all, you are at risk from. 1870, we passed the 15th Amendment, says black people can vote, but not without poll taxes and literacy tests in association with crime. In fact, the first African Americans who tried to vote were often the first target of police departments when a crime would go down, even though they might not have been anywhere near the vicinity, but having your name and address was enough to make you a criminal. 1876, we passed the 14th Amendment, and citizen means everybody who was born here, but in 1883, the United States Supreme Court says in a series of civil rights cases that the 14th Amendment does not extend to black people in private facilities, hotels, restaurants, or on railroads, setting the stage for what we call Jim Crow that existed back then, and what Michelle Alexander in 2012 tells us is the new Jim Crow that exists right now. 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson determines that segregation is legal in the United States and paves the way absolutely for separate but unequal Jim Crow. 1909, the Niagara Movement stimulates the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, where white people retained the leadership for the first 100 years. The myth of meritocracy suggests that black people are innately inferior. The first intellectual of his time to write that down was Thomas Jefferson in the Virginia Papers. All the while, he was keeping Sally Hemings in concubinage. 1910 to 1970, the Great Migration, 14 states from the South saw African Americans without Dr. King, without Fannie Lou Hamer, without Malcolm X, Roy Wilkins or Medgar Evers or A. Philip Randolph, saw them move and change the composition of the United States of America based on the lynchings that they were recording every day at the NAACP, that you could not live safely in the South, so 14 states saw their people migrate. The problem, Isabel Wilkerson says in her modern day, The Great Migration, her big book that tells the story of Mahalia Jackson and Jesse Owens and Richard Wright and, frankly, President Barack Obama and how he came to be, that in 1940 to 1970 was a second Great Migration. Isabel Wilkerson says the problem with the North is they wanted the labor but not the people. That's still the problem with the North. We think we didn't participate in slavery, so we look down our nose at the South, but it's better, I think, to have a man tell you what he thinks of you than to be Minnesota nice and have you remain uncertain. Langston Hughes in The Ballad of Roosevelt talked about the condition for African Americans at a time when Tim Wise, the activist against white supremacy, says that white people were polled and they were asked how well black people liked it in segregation, and the truth was white people really thought it was cool, that we thought it was okay to have to go to the back, that our kids can't swim in that pool. These are the lies that the majority narrative tells so you can sleep at night. So a culture can claim at once to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, but only if you're a white, property-owning man at the beginning of the Constitution, and not if you were a woman, including the fact that George Washington's wife was richer than he was, but I'm just saying. The Ballad of Roosevelt The pot was empty and the cupboard was bare. I said, Papa, what's the matter here? I'm waiting on Roosevelt, son. Waiting on Roosevelt. Roosevelt, Roosevelt. Waiting on Roosevelt. The rent was due and the lights was out. I said, tell me, Mama, what it's all about. We're waiting on Roosevelt, son. Waiting on Roosevelt. Roosevelt. Just waiting on Roosevelt. Sister got sick and the doctor wouldn't come because we couldn't pay him the proper sum. A-waiting on Roosevelt. 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 A-waiting on Roosevelt. Then one day they put us out of the house. Ma and Pa was meek as a mouse. Still waiting on Roosevelt. 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 But when they felt those cold winds blow and didn't have no place to go, Pa said, I'm tired of waiting on Roosevelt, Roosevelt, Roosevelt. I'm damn tired of waiting on Roosevelt. I can't get a job and I can't get no grub. My backbone and navel's doing the belly rub. A waiting on Roosevelt, Roosevelt, Roosevelt. A lot of other folks what's hungry and cold and stop believing what they've been told by Roosevelt, Roosevelt, Roosevelt. 'Cause the pot's still empty and the cupboard's still bare, and you can't build a bungalow out of air. Mr. Roosevelt, listen! What's the matter here? The United States has a history of passing laws that make it feel good. But did you know that the South African system of apartheid came to study the United States system of Jim Crow in order to make it as severe as possible in South Africa? And Nelson Mandela freed us from the ideology of supremacy and inferiority. In 1917, The Social Diagnosis was published by Mary Richmond. It's the first textbook on social casework, marking the development of a body of social work knowledge and techniques. But again, white people believing that they have the answer for all the other people. 1929 sees the Great Depression. They said white people developed a cough, blacks pneumonia, and it prompted Langston Hughes to write the Ballad of Roosevelt. 1914 to 1918 saw the First World War. 1932, Hattie Wyatt Caraway of Arkansas is the first woman in the United States Senate. She filled her husband's vacant seat when he passed away. 1932, before women are allowed any access to the body politic outside of the vote. 1930, Ralph Ellison tells us about the invisible man, that I'm living in the same building as you, that I go to work every day, I have a family and I pay bills and you still can't see me. What reminds me of Minnesota culture every time I walk around the lakes and you can't catch anybody's eye because Minnesota nice means we don't talk and we don't see and we don't look. 1935, President Roosevelt creates the Aid to Dependent Children program, which continued under Bill Clinton until 1996, a program that still serves more white people than black people, but the majority narrative says we're idle and lazy, though we built the entire United States, but we must have gotten lazy in the last few decades because that's what the majority narrative says, so that's why we don't get a job. 1950 to 1953, we fought the Korean War. In 1950 to 1975, for 25 years, we fought the Vietnam War. In the 1960s, movies like Claudine helped us to define what was happening to black communities, that now that welfare was originally identified for white women whose husbands were not coming back from World War II, but it was clear that now white women could start to get jobs to feed their families, and welfare became synonymous with black and brown communities. That it sparked the civil rights movement, the time when black people defined for ourselves who we were for the first time, named ourselves for who we were, and defined what black was, and it caused white America to have to change its relationship, because if you know you're in a friendship, a partnership, a marriage, whatever, when you change, something else has to change. And that's really what happened in the civil rights movement. And it freed white people too. Because we all grew up racist, we're still racist. And until we get rid of it in our own consciousness and remove it from our institutions, we will always be racist. 1963, Dr. King shared a dream. 1964, Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act, and Fannie Lou Hamer asks, is this America, the home of the free and the land of the brave? In 1964, at the Democratic National Convention, she was unable to be seated as a Mississippi delegate in a state where 90% of the population was black and 100% of its politic was white. And the Hubert Humphrey, the great, wonderful civil rights pioneer that we paint him to be, he was indeed wonderful and very complex, told Fannie Lou that while she couldn't be seated with her own delegation in Mississippi in a meaningful way, she could sit with Michigan. To get familiar with the process, she summarily refused. 1965, The Civil Rights Movement forces Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act. 1971, young people was the first time the voting age was moved to 18 from 21, even though, excuse me, the United States had been sending you to war for all those years. You couldn't vote on the politicians who would vote for war. 1982 was the deadline for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, and it passed. Not the amendment, the deadline, because it didn't have enough votes. Peggy McIntosh for Minnesota Philanthropy Partners recently created the 5 myths that she says support white privilege. They are still the 5 myths that inform racism today. I want to be clear with you that racism is a verb and it requires power to be able to do it. This whole idea of reverse racism, post-racial society is all baloney. Same way that the victor wrote the narrative with one person's history, that's baloney. That the myth of meritocracy, that white people somehow were given the brains and everybody else is just dumb and not able to catch on. And so we need white people to fix everything for us. Well, I would ask, after all these years of history, how's that working? Not very well. Manifest destiny, that the money's in the land and God somehow ordained because they were white. By the way, whiteness was invented to be able to acknowledge and identify why you would keep slaves, who were also human, but if we acknowledge them as such, then we would be terrible people, so we called ourselves white. No longer French and Prussian and Russian and all those things by nationality, we just called ourselves white. And we told the servants, the white servants, that they were better just because they were white. And somehow, because we're white, God gave us the land, but he didn't do it for any other reason than because we're white. Oh yeah, but plus we're the smartest, so it makes sense he would give us the land. And by the way, there's a myth of monoculture. There's only one kind of American. We're seeing that everywhere with Barack Obama's election and re-election. Give us our country back. Truth be told, Christopher Columbus didn't discover America. He got lost and thought he was in India. And the truth unravels from there. As Malcolm X said, the Pilgrims didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock landed on us. Black people were in the what's now the continental United States long before the Europeans, after the indigenous Native Americans. We were not simply brought here as slaves. White moral elevation, that it suggested that white people, because they're white, are spiritually superior. I want to know what kind of culture does what white culture has done and can call itself the moral superior. This is why Dr. King said that the way the United States treats black people demonstrates its moral compass. That's why the leaders coming out of the black community have generally been moral leaders. They've been coming to places like the pulpit, the altar, to make you be the person you want to be, to live your faith, to see injustice and call it out. I have a friend, Heather Hackman. She does all kinds of consulting around white privilege. She's white. And she was telling a story the other day in one of her trainings that she went into the airport and she saw a woman who was just before her in the security line in a hijab. And she realized that all the TSA people kind of started shifting and looking funny and everybody's looking sideways and everything else. So Heather recognized that this woman was likely to be profiled. So she went up to her and she said, "Oh, hello, how are you? It's good to see you again." The woman's like, "What?" I have no idea. She's smiling that great Minnesota nice, like, "What?" And sure enough, as soon as Heather came up, TSA rested. That's what I'm talking about making your faith work in the world. It does no good for you to see injustice and go home and pray about it. It's better if you get up and do something about it. The myth of white racelessness, the fact that white people are white and everybody else is a race, is baloney. There is no scientific evidence, none, that there's any difference in any of us, that you could tell that I'm black and you're white. The Science Museum of Minnesota is in fact bringing back their Facing Race exhibit, which identifies at the very beginning of the exhibit that all life started in Africa. And if you think Africans are mostly white in that climate, sorry, but you got more work to do. And Peggy McIntosh in Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack says this idea of white racelessness, the myth of monoculture, white moral elevation, manifest destiny, and meritocracy still rule the world. I'm in conversations, it doesn't matter how many degrees I have or how many places I've been or that I've keynoted at Stanford. The number one thing people come up to me in large white audiences, "You are so articulate." And I never know how to take that. I never quite know how to take that, and I always blame that on the myth of race. Because if we didn't have these mythologies about supremacy and inferiority, I could take your compliment in likely the spirit that it's intended. But thanks to the myth of race and how racialized we are in our society, I have to ask myself, was that a hidden statement for most blacks don't speak the King's English. These are the myths that, we like it or not, exist in our churches, in our schools, in our institutions, and we wonder why they claim an achievement gap. Because if the only history that you are ever told says that one group of people did everything right and you stink, how much history would you want? If you get 28 days to celebrate the likes of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, you couldn't fill up 28 days fast enough with all of the legends that exist in black communities. And Barack and Michelle Obama are not an exception to the rule. Everybody is not a teen pregnancy. All our boys are not in gangs or on drugs, and we don't want to take your purse at the Mall of America. But these mythologies determine who we hire, who comes inside our churches. Dr. King and James Baldwin later credited Malcolm X, the most segregated place in the United States, as church on Sunday morning. That says a lot about faith. So finally, we look to 2014 in Minneapolis, and some people tell me we are living in a post-racialized society. My mother was German, white. My father is African American and black. And people keep trying to tell me I'm all mixed up because I really don't know which way to go. I'm telling them, actually, you're mixed up. And James Baldwin told you right where to go. If it's your problem, this N-word, if it's your problem, this racializing, then the biggest favor I can do is give you your problem back. It's not a problem that I have, because I've never known any N-words, never even seen one. Know that I'm not one myself. I'm not afraid of my father or my son or my husband or my brother. I'd be more afraid of some dude I didn't know, whatever color he was, coming toward me, than I would be afraid of my own. But in 2014, while we celebrate this Minnesota with the great lakes and the fantastic fitness and all these wonderful things, I celebrate it too, but Algernon Austin of the Economic Policy Institute says, if you are a black man with no felony and a college degree, you are 3 times less likely to get a job than a white man with a felony and no college degree. Economic Policy Institute right here in River City. Redlining and segregated lending are documented everywhere. There are maps of the Minneapolis, for example, in 1933 that indicate where all the Negroes will live, where the Bohemian section will be, which is where I live in Northeast Minneapolis. It says where the Jews will live. It says where the foreigners will live. It says where the working men without families will live. And it's very fascinating because that's where we live. Achievement gap isn't a gap. It's a gap saying that that history doesn't represent me and that story doesn't sound right. And slaves were not the only thing in black people's history, and that's not even when black people first came on the scene. And now black boys and brown boys aren't interested in that narrative, and we call it an achievement gap without looking at the fact that what's left in public education are old white women who still believe the mythologies of white privilege and then teach to them. Malcolm X was told he wouldn't make a great lawyer. Malcolm X would have been a killer lawyer. That's the problem. The health gap. The Minnesota Department of Health has now on their website, for those of you who like to do web searches, this report which indicates that because of structural racism directly, your life expectancy if you are brown or black in the state of Minnesota is noticeably shorter. As James Baldwin said, nothing you've done nor nothing you can do, you realize by the time you're 30 to keep this from happening to your children and grandchildren. In Minneapolis, black boys are 7 times more likely to die of homicide than their white counterparts. Nationally, the condemnation of blackness has led to the killing of Oscar Grant, Jordan Davis, Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBride. The names go on and on and on. A 1-car accident at your door. You're safe in your house. I don't think you need to shoot me on your porch. My kids are listening to loud music in a van. You don't like it, certainly say something to them, but is it worth shooting them to death? And then having a jury decide that you are guilty of trying to shoot the 3 other boys who got away, but not the one you killed. The myth of race is real, and there is no post-racial society until we can divest and transcend what Dr. King was able to do, what Malcolm X ultimately was able to do, what Fannie Lou Hamer was able to do. This isn't about white people and black people. It's about a state of mind. The cradle to the prison pipeline is now leading to privatized prisons. Michelle Alexander, writing about the new Jim Crow, standing your ground, results in deadly consequences for black people. And as quiet as it's kept, it results in deadly consequences for you. As a person, if you look at Tony Soprano, I used to like that show a lot, And the one thing that I always thought was most scary about his position as the head of the mob was that you had to spend 24 hours a day worried if somebody's going to try to knock you off. And interestingly, that's exactly what the myth of race does to white people. It makes them fear people who have no desire to hurt you, who want for their families the same thing you want for your family. So that when my son was 16 years old, I had to teach him about how to drive and to keep the radio off and not let him have all his friends in the car and to respect the law and to buckle up. Same thing you had to tell him, your kids. And then I had to tell him how to drive while he's black, while he's likely to have more contact with the police, what the best way is for him to stay safe. And I can go into 1,000 churches on Black History Month, and I can speak at 1,000 universities. But in the words of Moms Mabley, nothing changes if nothing changes. So the education you're giving yourselves about the rest of the people in the world and the new narrative that you are writing that fills in everyone's voices at the table will be key to this congregation's liberation. And just like the gospel, we are meant to take out into the city. It will mean the world to everybody who lives here. Frederick Douglass knew that when one class of people is made to feel like they are the problem, and that everything that is set up for them is bad, then neither persons nor property will be safe. But that's an unnecessary outcome if we can simply tell ourselves the truth. I'm human, you're human, and one way or another, beauty, we're in this together. Thanks a lot.